Okay, can everybody hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, thank you. All right, I think we're ready to roll. Yeah. All right, so welcome everybody. I already see that we're okay. Um, all right, so let's get started. Uh, Vayera is a special parsha for us. It's our son Ari, Hashem Yikom Damo's bar mitzvah parsha. It's a very beautiful parsha, one of the most famous. We read it not only now, but we read it, of course, on much of it on Rosh Hashanah, the first 2 days. That's the parsha of the Yamim Noraim. It was not easy. I always tell this story. It was not easy, never easy teaching your own child. I think it was not easy teaching Ari his parsha. And I always say that when you read the Akedah, you ask, how is it possible that Abraham could take his son and he's going to slaughter him? But if you start teaching your kid bar mitzvah, sometimes you can relate to that. It's very difficult. In any case, you have high standards. Well, we're not going to talk about the Akedah, uh, although there's great things to talk about it. We're going to talk about a different subject. I think I've told you before the story about I was in yeshiva reading the newspaper. I don't know why I've always been a news junkie. You just can't get enough of the news and reading about it, watching it, etc. And so he saw me reading the newspaper and he just looked at me and he said, I don't know why you're reading that paper. The newspapers are just full of sex and violence. If you want that, you can go right to the Torah. You don't need to read a newspaper. And there is a lot of truth to that, certainly a lot of violence. And as we're going to see, a lot of interesting sexual overtones as well. And we're going to kind of center our discussion around the whole story of Lot. And he is mentioned in a few different parshiot, and he is an interesting character. He's one of those people we have, in addition to the main actors, we have kind of, you would say, bit actors, people who aren't involved that deeply within the Torah, but they certainly are important figures, and you need them. Lot is somebody as well that is the subject of a lot of controversy. We saw last week that Abraham risks his life to save Lot, and the primary answer as to why he did that, of course, it was his nephew. The question is, did he really deserve to be saved? Did Abraham have to risk his life? After all, Lot chose to live in Sodom, which we know is, we said that last week, I think, is the original sin city, even before Las Vegas. And Abraham knew that Lot was a bit of an unscrupulous character. He was very clever. The story is told about Lot that, well, Abraham separated from him because he said, I can't really stay together with you because you're not honest. Your animals are eating the from the pastures of that are not ours. And so he was very clever, Lot. He said, well, you told me that this land is promised to the Jewish people, to your descendants, and I'm among your descendants, so I'm going to get the land anyway. I'm just taking my share early. Abraham did not like to hear that, and that's what really troubled him, and they separated. He said, you go your way, I'll go mine. He did not want to be around someone who who was going to kind of come up with this alternative morality and justify even the things that Abraham knew were really immoral and unlawful, etc. He goes to Sodom, Lot, and he does in a way distinguish himself in that he does try to protect the angels when they come to his home. And for that, Chazal, the rabbis say that demonstrating that sense of right and wrong, not wanting these hosts to be attacked, that seems to be an Oriental tradition. You protect and you take good care of your guests. So that's one of the reasons they say that he was worthy to be saved. But the primary reason is because he is going to be the ancestor of Ruth. Ultimately, Lot is, as we'll see in a moment, and comes Moshiach, and therefore it was important that he had to live. Let's backtrack for a moment, try to understand the very mysterious and murky path of the Moshiach. It is not perhaps how we would have assumed this history and this story would have been told if we were trying to sanitize it, and maybe even in today's world where you kind of are reluctant to say anything that even smacks of being illicit. Nevertheless, you see a trail that starts from the beginning of time all the way till the end. And we're going to take a quick look at that. Start all the way back with the first person, Adam Harishon, who has two sons. The Torah does not record that there were other children besides Cain and Hevel. Later on, there would be a third child, Shet, but we're told that there had to be girls as well. How are we going to propagate the world if there were not women? So clearly, those women were the sisters of Cain and Hevel. So according to tradition, Cain, Mary, they each were born with a twin sister. Nevertheless, they were all brothers and sisters. So Cain married Hevel's sister, and Hevel married Cain's twin sister, and that is how the world began and began to be propagated. Well, of course, that is a case of clearly we know that's incest, and it's one of the, if not the most severe act of immorality. When we talk about Gilui Arayot, there are other examples, but incest is at the top of the list. So how is it possible that the world began with an act of incest? So here the rabbis tell us, and David HaMelech has it in one of the Tehillim, and uses this famous phrase, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, that this world was built upon the foundation of Chesed, and it was a Chesed for this to be allowed so that the world could continue. Otherwise, they would have just died right there, or died out right there. So this concept is a fascinating one, because we see that later in Vayikra, when we talk about the different categories of erva, that which is sexually prohibited, and we come to the case of, as many of these things are listed, who is allowed to sleep and have relations with who. When it comes to incest, so there the Torah uses the word chesed. Well, how is that considered to be a chesed, an act of kindness? Well, again, it dates back to this first incident of incest, when, to propagate the world, there was incest in the first family. And it also contains another concept, and that is that, in a sense, what's happening here is a sin is being committed, and yet there is also a chesed involved. For an example of that, one of the classic examples is what happened to Dinah when Dinah was kidnapped and raped by Shechem. Afterwards, nobody wanted to have any part of Dinah. And ultimately, there's all kinds of opinions as to what happened to her. But one of the strong opinions is that since nobody else would marry her, Shimon, her brother, married her. And then they produced this child that would ultimately go down to Egypt and would be married to Yosef. Okay, that's another story. But the idea is, yes, marrying your sister was the height of immorality, and yet it was a chesed since nobody else would marry her. Of course, this is all before the Torah was given, but still. But there is a kind of, mirror image or double image when whenever you do a chesed, there may very well be attached a negative to it as well. When you give charity to a poor person, yes, you're doing something that is a chesed, but from the other person's point of view, it's reinforcing the fact that they cannot take care of themselves and somebody else has to care for them, which only makes them feel lower and more humiliated, etc. So there's always like a flip side, and this is true here as well. So it's not something that we would sanction and allow today, but we see that in history, in Jewish history, it's still part of the story. We come, and just to kind of, not going to dwell on this, but just to kind of show how despicable the rabbis consider incest to be in the story of Noach. Well, there's a whole debate. What happened there with Noach? The Torah is very unclear what was done. But as a result of it, we come out with the statement, Arur Canaan. Canaan is to be condemned and cursed. Well, but what did Canaan do? Ham, we say, right? They had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafet, and Ham did something which the Torah doesn't really delineate exactly, but one of the opinions is that one idea is maybe that they castrated Noach so he wouldn't have more children. But there's another opinion that says that Ham had sexual relations with his mother. And that, of course, is one of the most terrible forms of incest. And the child that was produced was Canaan. And so the Torah says, Arur Canaan, that this idea of this kind of sexual depravity as illustrated or indicated by incest, that's something associated with only the most perverse cults, religions, communities like Canaan. And therefore, it doesn't say that Ham is cursed, which you would have expected, but Canaan, who kind of is the living reminder of the act that was done. So it's a whole other share about that, but at least it's telling us how contemptible it would be to engage in incest, even though we have cases of it. Abraham, in our Parsha, he saves Lot, who is a charter member of Sodom, a sodomite. And we know the story that happens where his daughters become convinced that the world is coming to an end. They get their father drunk and they produce these two children, Ammon and Moab. Now, the truth is that although this is a terrible act of incest, nevertheless, the commentators portray these two daughters as, we don't really know their name, they're portrayed as being righteous women, and they felt to save the world, we're going to have to engage in an act of incest with our father. Lot is not, they believe the whole world is coming to an end. There's an opinion that Lot understood that this fire and brimstone was coming down in his area, but not necessarily to the whole world. Nevertheless, they get him drunk the first night. The second night is more on him. Why did he allow it to happen twice? In any case, so these two children are born, Ammon and Moab, and we know that although they are the product of this incestuous relationship, which would make them, of course, mamzerim and really, in a sense, persona non grata, nevertheless, in the course of history, they produce two very, very important, crucially important people, because from Moab, which literally means from father, we'll talk about a story at the end, quite a wild story, and that involves this specific name, really publicly saying, this is a child I had with my father. And the other one, Ammon, which is a little bit hidden there, his nation etc. But they produce these descendants that are instrumental in the course of Jewish history. We know, of course, that from Moab is going to come Ruth, and she is going to be the ancestress of David HaMelech and, of course, Moshiach. And then also the other daughter produces ultimately from Ammon comes Naamah. Naamah is one of the wives of Shlomo, but also the mother of Rechavam, who is one of the kings, and he becomes a link in the chain of Moshiach. So although their origins are very inauspicious, but they're producing these two central characters that are going to be part and parcel of the coming of Moshiach. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Then going on in history, we have Yaakov. Now, Yaakov is I guess what you'd have to call a bigamist. Yaakov commits the sin, although again, remember that the Torah has not been given, but there is this tradition that still certain principles of the Torah were kept by the Avot and Imahot. So he marries two sisters. This is, of course, absolutely forbidden. It's not exactly incest, but it is certainly part of Gilui Arayot. And as long as the other sister is living, you can't marry the sister. After a sister would die, then you can marry a sister. This happened in the Holocaust many, many times, that men would marry their sisters-in-law after their wife, the other sister would die. So when sisters are living, you can't marry both of them. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but the Torah is just very clear that is an act of immorality. You might say it's kind of a subcategory of incest. But Yaakov marries Leah, then he marries Rachel. So he never really should have married Rachel. And that is one of the reasons why Rachel will die an early death, because when they come to the borders of Israel, when they're living in Chutz La'aretz, you can get away with that kind of thing because immorality is more rampant there. But when you come to Israel, there's a higher standard, and therefore, as they come into Israel, to coming by Ephrat, that is when Rachel dies in childbirth. And the fact that Yaakov did it in the sense knowingly, well, ultimately, of course, those children needed to be born, Yosef and Binyamin, also for the progression of history. We believe in a Moshiach ben Yosef who will precede a Moshiach ben David. So it's important to have Yosef be created and be alive and give rise to that as well. But clearly it is something that later on will be absolutely forbidden. And then shortly after comes the story of Yehuda. And here Yehuda goes looking for a prostitute, and the Torah is very clear about that. That he's not going to a J-date meeting. He's looking for in the place where prostitutes hung out, and that's what he's looking to do because his wife was gone, and the whole story then comes out about Tamar disguising herself as a prostitute and ultimately being impregnated by Yehuda. Which also is obviously questionable. In a sense, it's very much like the story of Lot, isn't it? Because Lot was both the father and the grandfather of those children. And I see your question there. I'll come back to that. Yehuda, like Lot, is also the second example of someone who is both the father and grandfather of the same children, because Zerach and Peretz are born, and Yehuda is both their father and their grandfather because he has impregnated his daughter-in-law. So here too, you have a whole lot of seemingly obscene or morally questionable acts going for the prostitute. Then it turns out to be his own daughter-in-law, etc. But from this union, they will not ostracize those children, And we'll have ultimately Yishai descend from Boaz, and David HaMelech will descend from Peretz. So we're putting all of these things together in trying to trace the lineage of Moshiach. It goes through some very sordid places. Prostitution, bigamy, incest, these are all part and parcel of the creation of Beit David and ultimately the Moshiach. And finally, David too is the subject of a lot of dispute as to how kosher his lineage is, because without going through, it's a long story, but essentially at some point in his life, after having 7 children, 7 boys, Yishai comes to feel that maybe I'm not really Jewish because I am descended from this union of Boaz and Ruth, based upon Boaz's decision as the leader of the court of the Beit Din, that it was, while it was forbidden to bring a male Moabite into the community of Israel, it was not prohibited or forbidden for a female Moabite to come in. And although he had had 7 children, at some point he got religion, perhaps, as sometimes happens in older years, and you become, extreme. And he said, maybe that was the wrong decision of my ancestor Boaz. And therefore, if he wasn't allowed to marry her, and I'm descended from them, then I'm not really Jewish. So he decides to separate from his wife. And then ensues this whole story where she's in the house, but he takes a pilegesh. He takes I wouldn't call her necessarily even a wife, but man cannot live without a woman. So he takes another woman, and she, the original wife, at some point, just as in the story of Leah and Rachel switching places, she switches place with Boaz, with Yishai's concubine, and then she is impregnated, and she ultimately, and by the way, there too, like in the story of Tamar, the other children, the 7 sons of Yishai, are very angry, believe that she, who was no longer married to Yishai, how could she get pregnant? She must have done this. She's a married woman because Yishai did not divorce her, so she's not allowed to get pregnant. So just like they called, some of them called for Tamar to be executed, so they want to do the same to Yishai's wife. But of course, that doesn't happen. She goes through with the pregnancy. When that child is born, Yishai doesn't consider him my son. And so he's told, you can't even stay in the house. You're going to take care of the animals. You're going to have a shack outside. I don't want you in my house. And when Shmuel Hanavi is told, go and anoint one of the sons of Yishai to be the next king, so he's not there. And Shmuel is confused. He doesn't get the signal on any of the 7 boys that they're the ones. Finally says, do you have any other people living here? He didn't even say children because Yishai didn't acknowledge him. And then, of course, they produce David, and walks into the room, and the bottle of anointing oil just jumps right out onto David's face. And Shmuel understands this is the one, the last person you would possibly expect to be the next king. And that's why throughout his life, David is castigated as a mamzer, and he has to struggle against that stigma for a long, long time until finally he is accepted and unites the nation. So from here, we just seeing all these different incidences of sexual indiscretion and questionable lineage, all part of the story of Moshiach. And from here, I think we see 2 things. The Gemara describes this succinctly and says, from the blackest dirt comes the richest crops. And so even though it's kind of black items in a sense, they have a black mark on them. This is how Moshiach is produced, sending the message that never second guess Hashem. The person you think is most apt to be Moshiach may not have any connection whatsoever, but the person you think could never be Moshiach, maybe the one with the torn blue jeans and the earrings and nose rings and toe rings, etc. Maybe that's the person that Hashem has chosen. That's why we have one story in the Gemara of meeting Moshiach, at least the potential Moshiach, and that is a beggar sitting in Rome. He's asking, for alms. He's covered with bandages, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi sees him, and he recognizes he is the potential Moshiach. He doesn't become Moshiach because he says that really depends on us, but he was the person that could have been Moshiach. So it's not necessarily the one that with the longest beard and the most the greatest Talmudic scholar, not necessarily. You cannot really predict the path that Hashem will take ultimately, and I think it helps us to understand that we should be careful about prejudging other people. And maybe we're actually talking to somebody who is the potential Moshiach, even though we think, well, they're not qualified at all, because all of these other examples show us that it may be the person you would least choose for that high-ranking position in Jewish history. And we'll probably be very, very surprised when it happens. I want to end with a story. It's kind of an incredible story. I know I read the story once to David before. It's a story about Rav Moshe that is said to occur in the winter of 1921 in Luban, Russia, by somebody who actually was there and recorded this story, and told of a man in the town of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who is a distinguished member of the community who suddenly became ill, deathly ill, from a peculiar illness. And as part of it, his tongue became very swollen and infected. From the sickbed of this man, he requested that Rav Moshe come and visit him. And when Rav Moshe entered the room, the man asked that everyone else leave. I want to be alone with Rav Moshe, and I want to tell him an incident, he said, that occurred only a few days earlier. He said that it was Parsha Vayera, this Parsha that we're reading this week, where we talk about the story of Lot's daughters. And he says, the man says, I was very troubled about the fact Moshiach would come from this very promiscuous union, this incestuous union between a drunken father and his two daughters. Even if they felt that they had to do what they did, how do they have the audacity to publicize it and call the children Moab, which means from a father? And why aren't they ashamed? Surely God could find someone with a more perfect pedigree, with an ancestry that doesn't include incest. And he said, shame on them. And he said, I started to ridicule the daughters of Lot, and I started to speak of them as being disgraceful. And then he said, that night, he said, I had a dream. Two very old women appeared to me. Their faces were covered. They introduced themselves as the daughters of Lot. They said that in the world of truth, the Olam HaEmet, they heard my question concerning their behavior, and they have come in this dream to set the record straight and explain themselves. So they said as follows: we were Abraham's grandnieces. Abraham had a reputation of someone who experienced miracles. In addition, we were saved by a miracle from the destruction of Sodom and Amorah. We had the street cred, so to speak, to claim that the child we're carrying in our wombs was not conceived from our father, but was rather impregnated by God. We could have gotten away with it. Due to our spectacular family history, our reputations would have remained as pure as the driven snow, and people would have viewed our children, our sons, as demigods and viewed us as saints. So why did we choose to publicize openly that our sons were conceived from their own grandfathers? It is because we knew that one day in the future, there would be a Jewish boy born from a Jewish mother who would not behave so nicely, who would make the claim that his mother did not need a male to impregnate her, and that God did the job. This Jewish boy would then be embraced by millions or billions as the Messiah. So thousands of years before the birth of this new religion and this new claim about a virgin birth, the daughters of Lot publicized to the world that a child can only be born from a physical mother and father, that God does not impregnate any women. They wanted to ensure that the Jews and the world would await for the real Moshiach. They were the ones who demonstrated that immaculate conception was immaculate deception. And since the daughters of Lot sacrificed themselves and their good name over millennia for the single purpose of rejecting a false Moshiach and holding up the fort for the real Moshiach, they in turn merited to have the real Moshiach come from their progeny. This ill man continued to relate his dream to Rav Moshe. The two women went on to chastise me for embarrassing them and speaking of them in disgraceful terms. They said that I would need cleansing and forgiveness for what I had done, comparing the sin to the sin of the spies who also spoke slander about Eretz Yisrael, and their tongues also were infected. We're told that the spies, the Meraglim, their tongues extended to their navel and worms came and crawled between it, and that's what killed them. So this is what happened. His tongue was also swollen, and they told him that would be his fate as well. The man, according to the story, finished speaking, turned his face to the wall, and passed away. Rav Moshe, standing at his bedside, was stunned, and here he believed he received living testimony from two women, the daughters of Lot, who lived 3,800 years earlier, and he felt that this was not some fictional novel. The man had told this story moments before his death, and it was a kind of bedside confession. And all his life till he died in 1986, Rav Moshe repeated the story which he experienced with his own eyes back in the winter of 1921. It's a pretty wild, crazy story, but it does have kind of the same point. Be careful about too much judging of others, because you just really don't know. It might be that the lowlife the person you think is a lowlife, the one you're insulting, may actually be the Moshiach, or maybe the ancestor or ancestress of the Moshiach, like the daughters of Lot. So a lot to think about. I think the Torah never ceases to surprise us. It's filled with a lot of twists and turns. And clearly, we are we're living in a miraculous times. We're seeing things today that if we write about it, the future may never believe it, whether it's the beepers going off, or, all the real miracles that Israel is accomplishing. We should be very grateful that we are front row seats to what's going on, but hopefully this is all going to lead us to the end game of history, and that is the coming of Moshiach, the Geula Shalema B'Mehera B'Yameinu. So thanks everybody for listening in, and we hope that we will see you next week, same time, same place. Alexa asked if it was immoral, surely Yaakov should have been punished for marrying the two sisters. Yeah, you can make a case for that. But the moment Rachel married him, that was where the sin kicked in. And I guess, like we see throughout history, women are always have the highest level of Mesirat Nefesh, much more so than men, although our soldiers certainly are exhibiting fantastic Mesirat Nefesh as well. But we should never shortchange the women. Let's end with the tefillah for the Chayalim. Yishaber Chavotenu Avraham Yitzchak V'Yaakov Yivarech Chayalei Tzva Hagana Yisrael Homdim Al Mishmar Tzenu Barei Eloheinu Migvul Lebanon Ad Midmar Mitzrayim Min Hayam Hagadol Ad Labar Rava B'Yabasha Ba'avir Ubayam Yitein Adonai Taveinu Kamim Aleinu Nigafim Lifneihem HaKadosh Baruch Hu ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה, מכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם, ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם, ויעטרם בחטא ישועה ועטר ניצחון. ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם הולך עמכם להילחם לכם עם אויביכם להושיעכם, ונאמר אמן. Shabbat Shalom, בשורות טובות. Let us hope that our soldiers will be protected. It's really difficult times, as we know, hostages brought back, and we somehow resolve this in a way with, I don't want to get into talking about governments, but there's good news on the horizon. Let's put it that way. Bezrat Hashem. Shabbat Shalom to everybody.